We'll call the Water Policy Interim Committee back to order. Members, please take your seats. Our next agenda item is a discussion on the proposed federal administrative rule definition of waters of the U.S., and that's tab number 8 in your booklets and your binders. And I believe Karen Hamilton is going to give us a brief introduction, and then Julia McCarthy is going to walk us through a PowerPoint if I'm right. Well, welcome, Ms. McCarthy.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Is that okay? Can you hear me now? Thanks for the invitation to be here today and talk about this rule, this proposed rule. I'm Karen Hamilton, manager of our 404 program in Clean Water Act 404, and Julia McCarthy is our stream biologist who has become familiar with the rule, so we really appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation. We're here to talk about a proposal that aims to revise an existing regulation that's been in place since 1977. There is a lot of interest as well in the interpretive rule, which is a companion piece, but we're not going to be talking about that today. We'll just talk about the proposals for the change to the existing regulation. The revisions are necessary because since 1977, the existing rule has become outdated. Part of that, mostly because of the Supreme Court decisions in 2001 and 2006, created some confusion on how to implement the existing regulation. And so it made permitting fairly inefficient, difficult, and it took a while for permittees or people who were seeking permits to get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. It would also become inconsistent across the United States. There are 38 core districts, and so inconsistency was rampant across the United States. Consequently, about 100 or so organizations asked EPA and the Corps to revise the regulation in order to create some more clarity. We've become familiar with the fact that many people are not they're not real familiar with the existing rule. So what Julia is going to do is walk through the existing rule and then describe what changes about that rule. There are two supporting documents. One is a scientific report, creates the basis for some of the revisions. It's called Connectivity of Streams and Wetlands to Downstream Waters. And the other one is an economic analysis of the proposed rule. And both of those can be found at the website that Julia will show at the end of the presentation. But most importantly, that your thoughtful comments, recommendations, and suggestions to improve this rule are what we're seeking, what we in the Corps are seeking. Particularly in the West, there are very many special features on the landscape. Water management is not like it is in the East, and so we think that there are a number of places where this rule could be improved. There will be a lot of improvement before the rule is finalized, and it will be based on comments from people such as you who understand how important water is in the West and how it's managed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia to go through this presentation. And I appreciate being able to show this because I think you'll notice that being able to see things rather than trying to describe them will be very helpful.
Okay, the floor is yours, Ms. McCarthy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but hopefully this isn't too challenging to walk through this over the phone and then with the PowerPoint in front. I will, because it's kind of a more distance interaction, I'll stop a couple times while I'm going through the slides just to take a couple questions before moving forward. So there will be probably two spots that I'll stop in the middle of the slides, and then hopefully we can have some good questions and answers at the end as well. So Karen, if you can move it to the next slide. So recognizing that there's varying levels of understanding about what waters of the U.S. are and what's changing under the proposal, I wanted to organize the presentation for you guys today under three questions. And the first one is kind of a a 40,000-foot question, just generally what's covered under the Clean Water Act. And then we oftentimes have a lot of questions about what activities are exempt from the Clean Water Act, and so I'll briefly cover those as well. And then most of the time that I'm going to spend today is talking about what are currently waters of the U.S. under the existing regulation that Karen mentioned has been in place since the late 70s, and then how this existing definition is changing under the proposal. So next. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is what's covered under the Clean Water Act. If you can go to the slide with the pictures, Karen. So the Clean Water Act has been established to restore and maintain the integrity of our nation's waters. And in order to achieve this, the EPA and the Corps regulate the discharge of pollutants into waters of the U.S. And so this is, there's two pieces here. One is, we're talking about discharging a pollutant, and two, we're talking about discharging a pollutant into a water of the U.S. So a couple examples that I have here are wastewater treatment plants require a pollution discharge permit to discharge their effluent into waters of the U.S. And then on the right picture here with the backhoe, this is a picture of an example of a dredge and fill activity. So this is the program that Karen and I work in, which is permitting dredge and fill within waters of the U.S. So if an activity does not involve discharge of a pollutant, you wouldn't need a Clean Water Act permit, even if you have waters of the U.S. on your property. So going to the next slide. So this question of, am I regulated under the Clean Water Act? Like I said, if your activity doesn't involve discharge of a pollutant, then the proposed rule won't affect your activity because the Clean Water Act doesn't apply unless you're dealing with discharge of a pollutant into waters of the U.S. And so, we've had a lot of questions about, various Western water law and water quantity issues. And so I just want to point out here that really the Clean Water Act looks at maintaining water quality, and it doesn't deal with quantity at all. So what we're talking about are regulating discharges of pollutants, not necessarily quantity of water. So if you go to the next, so the next piece that I wanted to cover is this question of what is exempt from the Clean Water Act. And then the prior converted cropland slide, Karen. So prior converted cropland and waste treatment systems are not waters of the U.S. under the current regulatory definition. So prior converted cropland is an NRCS designation for land that was cropped prior to 1985. And then waste treatment systems are treatment ponds and lagoons, those types of things that are designed to meet Clean Water Act requirements. So right now under the existing regulation, they're explicitly not waters of the U.S. under the current definition, and they will continue to be exempt under the proposed rule. The proposed rule will not change how these exemptions are implemented. So these are existing exemptions that will continue. Next slide. So there are quite a few agricultural activities that are also exempt from various Clean Water Act permitting requirements. The first two here in purple, agricultural stormwater discharges and return flows from irrigated agriculture. These are statutory exemptions from the definition of a point source in the Clean Water Act itself, which means that agricultural stormwater discharges and return flows from irrigated agriculture are not regulated by any Clean Water Act permitting program. They are considered exempt from the Clean Water Act. So an example of that would be if you apply fertilizer to the agricultural fields and then a storm comes through and washes that fertilizer off, those agricultural stormwater discharges are exempt. You wouldn't be required to have a permit for that fertilizer runoff into the streams. Sediment and erosion is another example of that as well. The other bullets on this slide, the black bullets, are activities that are exempt from Section 404 dredge and fill permitting. So these include normal farming, silviculture, and ranching practices, upland soil water conservation practices, an important one here is construction and maintenance of farm and stock ponds and irrigation ditches. So construction and maintenance of irrigation ditches, those activities are exempt from Clean Water Act permitting. So if you're in there doing annual maintenance with the backhoe clearing out sediments or clearing out some of the ditch side vegetation and things like that, those types of activities wouldn't require a permit even if the ditch itself was considered to be a water of the U.S. The activities within it are exempt. And all of these activities that are listed here are and will continue to be exempt from permitting requirements regardless of whether these activities are occurring within a water of the U.S. or not. And that won't be affected by the proposed rule. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, exemptions are self-implementing, which means that these activities that were on this previous slide, approval from EPA or the Corps of Engineers is not required to conduct these exempt activities within a water of the U.S. And then, as always, if you're unsure about whether an activity is exempt or whether it's something that you can be conducting with or without a permit, calling the Corps of Engineers is always the best approach, and they would be able to answer your questions based upon the specific details on the property. So next slide. I'll stop here and see if anyone has any questions.
Julia, we'll do questions after you get done with your presentations and we take public comment. So we'll just take copious notes until then, but thank you for pausing.
Okay, all right, cool. Okay, so just to summarize before I move on, the question of am I exempt from the Clean Water Act, the agricultural exemptions, the activities I mentioned, and then also prior converted cropland and waste treatment systems, all of these exemptions are not changing. So if your activities involve those pieces, then the rule doesn't affect your property or you. So moving on to the next one. So the next piece that I want to cover is what are currently waters of the U.S. So as Karen mentioned, we have existing regulations, and in the last decade plus, we've had a couple Supreme Court cases that have come through that have really had an effect on how the EPA and the Corps of Engineers interpret these regulations. And so I want to kind of touch on what these regulations are and then also the effect that the Supreme Court cases have had on how we interpret them. So next slide. So again, this kind of starts off very broadly, but the Clean Water Act covers navigable waters, which are defined in the statute as waters of the United States and territorial seas. And I know that there's a lot of confusion about this term navigable waters and whether Clean Water Act jurisdiction is limited only to navigable waters. And I just want to point out that in order to protect and maintain the integrity of navigable waters, we must also protect and maintain the integrity of the non-navigable waters that feed these waters. And so therefore, the statute defines navigable to encompass all waters of the U.S., to ensure that the integrity of the navigable waters is maintained. And the statute doesn't further define waters of the U.S., but it leaves it to the Corps of Engineers and EPA to add detail through rulemaking, which is what we did in the late 70s. So in 1977, we wrote a definition of waters of the U.S., and that the current regulatory definition has gone essentially unchanged since the late 1970s. Next slide. And this slide here with these 7 bullets, this is a summary of the current definition of waters of the U.S. So as you can see here, waters of the U.S. definition includes traditionally navigable waters, and it also includes territorial seas, waters that cross state lines, impoundments of waters of the U.S. So this is a reservoir area that would be created behind a dam would be an impoundment. Waters that are within a single state's boundary where their use, degradation, or destruction could affect interstate commerce, and then tributaries of the above waters and wetlands adjacent to the above waters are all part of the existing definition of waters of the U.S. So waters that fall outside of this definition are not waters of the U.S. and are not regulated under the Clean Water Act. So some examples of waters that we would consider to fall outside this definition include ditches that are excavated in dry lands, wetlands created by irrigation, artificial lakes and ponds that were created in dry land areas. Next slide. So a couple other terms that I wanted to touch on before we move forward because they become relevant, I think, later in the presentation. The first is wetlands. So there is a current regulatory definition for wetlands in the existing definition of waters of the U.S., and it is the same as the definition that's in the proposed rule. And wetlands are essentially areas that are inundated or saturated enough that they support plants adapted to life in saturated soil conditions. So plants like cattails, sedges, rushes, willows, those tend to be indicators of a wetland area. And when the Corps goes out to determine whether it's a regulated wetland or not, or a wetland that meets the definition in the regulation, they look at vegetation, hydrology, and soil indicators to determine whether that wetland would be potentially something that would fall within the regulatory definition of a wetland. Another term that I wanted to cover is the term ordinary high water mark. An ordinary high water mark is also defined in existing regulation, and it's currently used by the Corps to determine the boundary between a water body and the surrounding upland area. So you can see here the yellow dashed line along the shore. So this is kind of marks where that ordinary flux of water is, that annual or semi-annual flow event that leaves that natural line along the bank, terracing, changes in vegetation, those types of things. And so if something is within that ordinary high water mark, then it would be part of the water. And if it falls outside of that ordinary high water mark, then it would be considered an upland area. And then I just said the word upland, which is not defined in the existing regulation, nor is it defined in the proposal. But I'll just point out that an upland is an area that is not a water or a wetland. So if it doesn't meet the regulatory definition of a wetland that I just mentioned, and if it falls outside of that ordinary high water mark for a stream or a water body, then it would be an upland area. And it would be something that would not be considered ever to be a water or a water of the U.S. It would be something not regulated by the Clean Water Act. Next slide. So I wanted to briefly touch on ditches, because we do have some ditches under the current regulation that we consider waters of the U.S. and are regulated under the Clean Water Act. And I will say I've never met two ditches that are alike. So these are just very general examples of the types of ditches that could potentially be a water of the U.S. So if you look at the slide, the figure on the left shows a ditch that receives water from a river and then discharges it back into either the same river or a different river. That would be an example of the type of ditch that that we would currently regulate as a water of the U.S. if it flows year-round or seasonally, and then if it flowed less than that, if it had a significant nexus, we would consider it a water of the U.S. under the way that we currently operate. And then on the right-hand side is another example, and so this is an example of a ditch that's draining water from a spring or a wetland into a regulated water body. And so again, if this type of a ditch flowed at least seasonally, it would be something that under the current practice would be considered a water of the U.S., or if it flowed less than seasonally, if it had a significant nexus. So I'll point out that even though these types of ditches would be considered waters of the U.S., all the exemptions still apply that I mentioned earlier. So yearly maintenance activities, construction activities, and these types of dredging would be exempt even if these ditches were considered to be waters of the U.S. The activities within them would continue to be exempt. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, there have been some Supreme Court cases that have affected the implementation of the regulations and have affected how we determine what is a water of the U.S. The first one I want to point out is Riverside Bayview in 1985, and in that one, the Supreme Court upheld the agency's regulatory definition, including adjacent wetlands, as waters of the U.S. And so if you remember that previous slide where we had all 7 of those waters, one being traditionally navigable waters, and then the waters after that, that's the definition that the Supreme Court said, hey, this regulatory definition makes sense to us, and they supported that. In 2001, we had the Swank decision, which basically had a large effect on whether things like playa lakes, wetlands, and prairie potholes are regulated under the Clean Water Act. And so following Swank, prairie potholes, for example, are evaluated on a case-by-case basis to determine whether they have an interstate commerce connection in order to be jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. And then the third case that we had is Rapanos and Carabel in 2006. And this one looked at relative flow permanence and significant nexus as the standards for case-by-case evaluation of jurisdictions. So essentially for tributaries that flowed less than seasonally, the Supreme Court said that they need to be evaluated and they can potentially be jurisdictional if they have a significant nexus to downstream navigable waters. So this complicated jurisdiction and raised questions as to whether waters like small headwater streams in mountain areas, high plains, intermittent and ephemeral streams, those types of resources, whether they had a significant nexus and whether they were jurisdictional and protected under the Clean Water Act. So, next slide. So going back to the list of 7 waters that are defined in the existing waters of the U.S. regulation, that big red circle represents the 3 parts of the definition of waters of the U.S. that were brought into question and confusion was raised around them following the Supreme Court cases. So right now for these 3 types of waters, a case-by-case evaluation is needed for a lot of waters within these categories to determine whether they're protected as waters of the U.S. So the proposed rule focuses on these areas that are circled in red here. And the goal of the proposed rule is to bring these 3 pieces of the waters of the U.S. definition into, to make them consistent with the Supreme Court cases. So the Supreme Court provided a narrower view of what can be protected as a water of the U.S., and the proposed rule attempts to incorporate that narrower interpretation of the Supreme Court into the definition and modify it so it's consistent with what the Supreme Court said the reach of waters of the U.S. should be. Now, Karen mentioned the connectivity report. So the other goal is to use the best available science to evaluate the connections of these types of waters to these downstream traditionally navigable waters. So this idea of a significant nexus. And so this connectivity report looks at the best available science and uses that science to improve the current definitions and ensure that the definitions provided in the proposed rule are scientifically sound. So next slide. So that is what we consider currently in the existing practice waters of the U.S. And now I want to briefly talk about how this changes under the proposed rule. I'm going to talk about this next part in 3 pieces because, as I mentioned, some of the existing definitions are unchanged because they weren't affected by the Supreme Court decisions. And then changes are proposed for some definitions. Those are the ones that were in that big red circle on the previous slide. And then we also have added a piece compared with the existing regulation. And what we've done is we've added a piece that describes certain types of waters that are explicitly not waters of the U.S. So as I mentioned before, if a water is not on that list of 7 waters that is in the regulatory definition, then it's not a water of the U.S. Well, what we've done is we've taken some concrete types of water features that we've generally not considered waters of the U.S., and we've formalized that in regulation and said these are explicitly not waters of the U.S. So next slide. So, traditionally navigable waters, waters that cross state lines, territorial seas, and impoundments of waters of the U.S., these were not affected by the Supreme Court cases on waters of the U.S., and there are no substantive changes from the existing regulation under the proposal for these 4 types of waters. Next slide. Go to the tributary slide, Karen. So tributaries under the proposed rule are jurisdictional when they meet the regulatory definition of a tributary. And so what's new in the proposed rule is that the rule for the first time proposes a definition of a tributary. And the definition of a tributary provided in the proposed rule are waters with bed and bank and an ordinary high water mark that contribute flow to traditionally navigable waters, interstate waters, or territorial seas. So the definition of tributary also, tributaries can include wetlands and man-made conveyances like ditches that also contribute flow to these downstream waters. So this idea of waters with a bed, bank, and ordinary high water mark. So essentially, I think, you know, what's different here is that we're not looking at flow permanence or the idea of whether water flows year-round or seasonally or less than that to determine whether it's a water of the U.S. But instead, what this does is it looks at those permanent physical characteristics, the bed and banks and an ordinary high water mark, with the idea that essentially if there's sufficient flow, either a sufficient frequency or a sufficient volume, that it establishes these permanent features on the landscape, that it creates these channel features, then that flow is sufficient to have an important effect on downstream waters. And this is supported by that connectivity report and the science, which basically concludes that tributaries, regardless of their size or the frequency of flow, have an important effect on downstream waters. And so that's the basis for this proposed definition in the rule. Next slide. So the next piece that's changing is how we deal with adjacent waters. And so in the proposal, this idea of adjacency is modified to include all waters, not just wetlands. So under the existing regulations, it talks about adjacent wetlands. And essentially the proposed rule looks at all adjacent waters. So this would include things like oxbow lakes or ponds, those types of things that fall within that adjacent stream environment. And this is, you know, again, based on the science that says that that waters that are within this adjacent area, whether they're wetlands or, you know, ponds or lakes or open water systems, they have this, you know, connection with the tributary system and an important influence on these downstream waters. So the other piece here that's changing is that the existing regulations define adjacent as bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. And the rule adds a definition of neighboring. So there isn't a definition of neighboring right now, and the rule proposes to add one. And the definition that they're proposing is waters within a riparian or floodplain area or that have a shallow subsurface or confined surface water connection. So this would be the idea of neighboring. And then riparian and floodplain areas are also defined in the proposal to add clarity to this idea of what is adjacent. And I just again want to point out that we're talking about this definition of neighboring being waters within a riparian or floodplain area. We're talking about just waters that are within there. So just something that meets the definition of a wetland or something that would have an ordinary high water mark. We're not talking about any of the upland areas that fall in the riparian or floodplain area. Like I said before, uplands are something that we would never consider a water. We would never regulate it under a water of the U.S. So when we're talking about adjacent, we're talking about adjacent waters within that neighboring riparian floodplain environment. Next slide. So the third piece that's changing is the language that is in the current regulation about interstate waters with an effect on interstate commerce. This language is being removed, and it's being substituted with a new category. Well, it's not a new category of waters. It's being substituted with an updated other waters category, which is essentially the same type of water. So intrastate waters with an effect on interstate commerce are what we generally refer to as the geographically isolated waters. And so this substitution looks at other waters as these geographically isolated waters as jurisdictional only, where on a case-specific basis they have a significant nexus to traditionally navigable water, interstate water, or territorial sea. And so essentially these geographically isolated waters will be evaluated under significant nexus as opposed to just a direct interstate commerce connection. And the idea behind that is that if they have a significant nexus to these downstream traditionally navigable or interstate waters, then that indicates a commerce link, because if they have a significant effect on these navigable waters and interstate waters, then they have an effect on the interstate commerce. There's a lot of interest by EPA and the Corps to receive comments on how other waters would be evaluated in this case-specific analysis. So in the proposal, other waters, the proposal says that other waters can be aggregated where they perform similar functions and are located close together in the same watershed. And the EPA and the Corps are looking for specific input on how this analysis could or should be conducted. So that's something that they're eager to receive some thoughtful comments on. Next slide. So this is just a summary slide for those of you who are visual people of the types of waters that I just discussed that are going to be updated in the proposed rule. So in the proposed rule, seasonal and rain-dependent streams, year-round streams, and rivers would all be considered waters of the U.S. where they meet that regulatory definition of tributary, so where they have a bed bank and ordinary high water mark. And then wetlands and waters with a surface connection, and also wetlands and waters within a floodplain, those types of waters would be considered adjacent, and therefore they would be considered waters of the U.S. under the proposal as well. I'll point out that floodplains themselves would not be jurisdictional. Floodplains is just one of the terms used to define this idea of adjacency. And then the last one are these other waters, and under the proposal, other waters would continue to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but they would be evaluated for a significant nexus to downstream waters. So that's kind of the summary, next slide, of the changes that are being proposed for the definition of waters of the U.S. So changes are proposed for the definition of tributaries, adjacent waters, and these other waters, or these geographically isolated waters. Next slide. So the last piece I want to cover are the waters that are not subject to Clean Water Act jurisdiction or permitting requirements. Next slide. So this list of waters, these are waters that we've generally not considered jurisdictional under current practice, and now we're formalizing that in regulations. So these waters include irrigated wetlands that would revert to upland if irrigation ceased, artificial lakes or ponds created on dry land, small ornamental waters created on dry land. An important one on here is groundwater. Groundwater is something that we've never regulated under the Clean Water Act, and what we're doing here is formalizing that in the regulation, saying that groundwater, including groundwater drained through tile drain systems, is not a water of the U.S., and it's not going to be regulated under the Clean Water Act. The last one on this list are gullies and rills and non-wetland swales, and this is intended to differentiate between erosional features that are formed following precipitation events from tributary streams. So these essentially represent erosional features that wouldn't have a bed bank or ordinary high water mark. Next slide. The other piece is that the proposed rule proposes two types of ditches which would now be considered exempt under the regulations. Ditches excavated wholly in the uplands that drain only uplands and have less than perennial flow. So if you look at the example on the left, here you have a ditch that if it's excavated or dug in upland areas and it's draining those upland agricultural fields and it flows less than year-round, that ditch would be exempt under the proposed definition of waters of the U.S. The other type of ditches that would be considered exempt would be ditches that don't contribute flow to these downstream waters. And so the example on the right is a generic example of that, where you have a ditch that pulls water off of a stream, and it's a terminal ditch, so it terminates in the uplands. It takes that water and it distributes it to the agricultural fields. That would be an example of a ditch that would not contribute flow. So that would be another example of an exempt type of ditch under the proposed rule. Next slide. So that's essentially the proposal. So those certain water features that I covered in the two types of ditches have been added as explicitly not waters of the U.S. under the proposal. And then we have modifications to 3 parts of the existing definition. That's all that I had. Next slide. Our public comment period has been extended to October 20th, and this website here is the website that Karen mentioned, where you can go and get a copy of the rule. That's where you can submit your comments in the docket. There's also a lot of other really good supportive information and fact sheets and questions and answers, things like that can help you understand better what the proposal is doing. And you can also access and look at all of the public comments that have been submitted. I think that there have been over 200,000 submitted to date, but all of those are publicly available on that website as well. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thanks, Julia. We'll have testimony from John Tubbs, Director of DNRC, then public comment, then we'll get to questions. Thank you for your presentation. Mr. Tubbs, welcome.
You bet. Members of the committee, John Tubbs, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation Director, and thank you. I guess I was the guy that responded to the quick inquiry about can we appear, so here I am.
Thank you.
The waters of the United States, we've been following it very closely. Prior to this, there was a draft guidance document out a few years ago. The rule was requested by a number of agencies if they were going to move forward. So EPA in 2011 pulled back the guidance, drafted the rule, and then that's what we are reviewing to date. I thought the explanation on the PowerPoint was very nicely done by Julie, and because a lot of this stuff is, as far as I'm concerned, and our issues in the state of Montana is chaff. I'm not going to fight over basically 4 of the 7 jurisdictional waters. Those would be interstate, international, all the lists that weren't changed by Rapanos and Swank. So you really have to focus on tribs, adjacent wetlands, and then some of the languages about exceptions, ditches in particular, are of interest to the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. And even within tributaries, you know, the rule is actually 12 pages of an 86-page Federal Register. So part of the thing is to just skip over the 74 pages of legal justifications for the rules and actually read the rule, because it's 1 page and a quarter of the next repeated, I think, 12 times. About that. There's several parts of what discharges are regulated under the Clean Water Act that the same 1 1/4 page applies to, you know, Part 328, Part 110, Part 112, and the list goes on in types of discharges. So it's really a page and a quarter, and if you focus on that language, I think we can get down to brass tacks of what's important and where our comments will come from. The other thing I wanted to state up front that wasn't mentioned by the presentation is 101G, Part 101G of the Clean Water Act protects all water allocations under state-based water systems. So if you have a water permit to divert, it is explicitly excluded from jurisdiction to allow that diversion to happen in the Clean Water Act. And so a follow-up conversation might be useful to just make it, crystal clear that the withdrawal of water from a tributary that may become jurisdictional, or is probably already jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act, is not a regulated activity under the Clean Water Act. In other words, you don't have to get a permit to withdraw water into a ditch. The other part that I'm really focused on is to make sure that the, while there is this exception, very few ditches in Montana, we own about 250 miles of ditch in DNRC, don't return water to a receiving river. Most of our, in fact, all of our ditches, and most ditches I'm aware of, have a certain amount of carriage water that when you divert it, it flows all the way to the end of the ditch and then is wasted back to a receiving stream, either the original stream it was diverted from or maybe another stream that it wastes back to. And the reason that carriage water is necessary is that you have to have enough head in your ditch so that the last on-farm diversion can divert water into its ditch that actually supplies the farm field. And so there's, say 10% of the water that's diverted still remains in the ditch at the end after the last diversion. And so that water has to be wasted back to someplace. Generally, that's not just wasted onto uplands. It's wasted back into a receiving stream. And oftentimes, that's an important return to that stream for flow management over the summer. I want to make sure that that return of water from a ditch is not a permittable action. Certainly the return flow in the ditch, the overland flow into the ditch wouldn't be permittable, but I'm worried about the carriage water itself. So I want to make sure that, and I believe EPA doesn't want to regulate that either, but I'm not sure that the current rule is clear enough in that exception. So we're going to focus on that. EPA is often the presenter on this issue, but to tell you the truth, it's the Army Corps of Engineers that I have the biggest questions for. If DEQ was presenting today, they would talk about the strong constitutional protections of waters in the state of Montana that we have and the associated statutory construct to protect water quality in our state. So jurisdiction by DEQ over discharges in Montana will remain strong regardless of the adoption of this rule or not. So I don't think the delta change for EPA-type permits actually changed the primacy agency's actions greatly, because we've got strong laws in the state that provide the protection and would require discharge permits regardless of this rule change. What I don't know and continue to try to find out is what the Army Corps thinks the change is. And I've made several calls, and so has Director Stone Manning, to get representatives of the Corps to talk to the state as to how they see jurisdictional changes associated with this rule. And in particular, again, I don't think we can fight perennial flowing streams. Even every year streams that clearly are discharging water into jurisdictional waters as tributaries. But these ephemeral riverbeds out in eastern Montana just is a big question mark to me as to whether the Army Corps currently would regulate them as a one-off, kind of analysis each time a pipeline tries to cross it, or that they really see that this clears up a problem for them and they will assert jurisdiction. If you read the information issued by the Corps and EPA, they indicate that nationally there's a 1 to 4% increase in what would be jurisdictional under the rule as opposed to what would be jurisdictional under the current guidance, all within Rapanos and Swanks in the current statute. But that because of the definitions are, collect these other waters as opposed to adjacent wetlands and stuff like that, there is probably a 1 to 2% nationally, 1 to 4% nationally increase in jurisdictional. I don't know that to be true with the Army Corps in the state of Montana. It is likely true for EPA permits because of the strength of our statutes to begin with. So that concludes my... Oh, and the one thing about ditches I wanted to mention, we pretty much do not want people to discharge their waste into our ditches, and I would highly recommend that as a ditch owner you question yourself when the industrial plant or the city comes to you and says, I would like to discharge my stormwater into your ditch. I would like to discharge my treated wastewater into your ditch. We currently have a permit for Manhattan to discharge its wastewater into a ditch because that was the least cost alternative, and the ditch owner agreed to accept that waste from the wastewater plant that we constructed the last decade in Manhattan. Frankly, I think it is to the advantage of the ditch owner that was permitted, because there's clear jurisdiction from the discharge back to the owner to the state that we authorize that discharge into that person's ditch. If you accepted it without a permit, I really am concerned about the long-term liability. And with our ditches, we would discourage people from trying to ask us to discharge into our ditches because of potential long-term liability with contaminants that may come through that discharge. I want to make sure the ditch itself is not permitted, but I would question, I would probably, if we accepted discharges into a ditch of ours, I would just as soon have that discharge permitted so that I could be protected as a ditch owner from the liability associated with the discharge itself. So with that, I'll end it.
Thank you, Director Tubbs. We'll open it up for public comment. Welcome, Mr. Benyon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is John Benyon. I'm here on behalf of the Attorney General's office, and just wanted to let you know real quickly that this rule, proposed rule, is being reviewed and discussed internally in our office. It's really premature at this point for our office to preview any kind of legal analysis on it, but we wanted to assure you that we were looking at it and that we think it's important to talk about this proposed rule with other state agencies here, the governor's office, stakeholders that this could potentially affect, and other state attorneys general. So we plan to do that, and there will be comments filed on behalf of the state of Montana. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Benyon. Further public comment? Any further public comment? Seeing none. Questions from the committee? Representative Cannell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question would be for Julie on the phone, if she can hear me okay.
I can hear you.
Thank you. In your presentation, one of the activities that you indicated that was exempt from the CWA was silvicultural practices and agricultural practices, and I forget the final one, but within those terms of, say, agricultural practices or silvicultural practices, that includes developing access to the grounds that are being involved. And so consequently, for example, under silvicultural forestry practices, then any drainage facility that is developed with road construction to access some harvest activity, is that then exempt under the CWA?
Yeah, so there's actually an explicit exemption for construction or maintenance of farm, forest, and temporary mining roads. So that is an explicit exemption that's in addition to kind of the normal farming, silviculture, and ranching practices. So the normal farming, silviculture, and ranching practices, that has to do with the practices associated with the actual harvest of those resources off of the land. But you're right, construction of access roads is also an explicit exemption under Section 404F. And there are some more details within the regulations on construction and maintenance of farm, forest, and temporary mining roads. So there is some detail in the existing regulation about how that exemption applies.
Follow up?
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You used the term temporary road after you discussed mining, Julie. Are you saying then that all of the roads that are being perhaps developed for agricultural or silvicultural purposes as well as then temporary? Or because I would suggest that many of them would be being built and designed for permanent status, and so I'm not clear what.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So the way that the exemption is stated is it's construction or maintenance of farm, forest, and temporary mining roads. So the temporary only applies to the construction and maintenance of mining roads. The farm and forest roads, there is no temporary piece associated with those. Can be constructed permanently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions? Senator Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Julia also. Mr. Chairman, Julia, you mentioned some, I think, 3 Supreme Court rulings that caused you to begin aligning your rulemaking with those decisions. I'm wondering, were there other court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, that were contrary on this same issue?
No, those are the 3 that we've had dealing directly with the interpretation and the definition of waters of the U.S.
Follow-up, Mr.
Follow-up.
Thank you. And a follow-up question is, has there been any type of assessment or disclosure of anticipated adverse impacts that this rule change may have on socioeconomic conditions?
So there was an economic analysis that was conducted as part of the rulemaking, and essentially that economic analysis concluded from a cost-benefit perspective that the benefits of the proposed rule outweigh the costs 2 to 1. So the benefits are worth twice as much as the costs associated with it. So the costs, I believe, were relatively minor compared to the benefits. But there was an economic analysis done, and that is available on the website. You can link to that and have a review of that if you're interested.
Thank you.
Further questions? Vice Chair Williams?
Mr. Chair, I think for Julia, and Julia, you can certainly defer to Karen. I'm not sure how you've separated your roles here. But when you say current rule or current interpretation or current guidance, is that the 2011 that you're referring to, or is that the 2008? Which, when you're saying...
Yeah, so the current regulation goes back to the late 70s. So that's that list of those 7 waters. So that is the current existing regulatory definition that's in the regulations itself. And then following Rapanos, we have a guidance that we have been operating under, which directs the EPA and the Corps how to interpret the Supreme Court decisions following those cases. So, yes, so we've been operating under just an informal guidance since 2008 to deal with the Supreme Court cases.
Follow-up?
Follow-up.
Mr. Chair, Julia, shifting a little bit, I'm a little confused on the separation and the roles between the EPA and the Corps as well. Could you explain why it's EPA way out ahead on this, and we're always asking questions of EPA and not the Corps? What arrangement do you have, or what's the dividing line between jurisdictions and roles?
Well, so the rule is a joint rule, so it's been jointly put out by EPA and the Corps. So the way that the Section 404 program works is it's similar to how like the pollution discharge program works. So with the pollution discharge permitting, MPDS, the states take on the role of permitting and implementing the pollution discharge permits, and then EPA has kind of more of an oversight role. And it's similar to how Section 404 is implemented, where the Corps has the day-to-day implementation of the 404 program. So they're the ones that are conducting jurisdictional determinations. They're the ones that are dealing with various developers, processing permit applications, making permitting decisions. And EPA has more of an oversight role as well. With regard to waters of the U.S. specifically, EPA also has the oversight or the final say in the geographic scope of jurisdiction of waters of the U.S. So with regard to the proposal, EPA, it is a joint proposal, so it's jointly proposed by EPA and the Corps. EPA is doing the outreach on the rule. The Corps has, a lot of work to do with the day-to-day implementation of the 404 program, and so they're really focused on just maintaining their workload as it is, as opposed to adding the additional workload of doing a lot of outreach on the proposal. So they're really focused on just making sure that they can meet their project and permit deadlines, and they're kind of leaving it to EPA to be the ones that are more out there with the public outreach on the proposal. But it is a joint proposal between the two agencies.
Follow-up?
Follow-up.
Thank you, Julia. And again, Julia, Mr. Chair, and these are sort of questions that I wrote down through your presentation, so they differ from each other a bit. If we move to ditches, obviously a ditch that's diverting water from a live stream that is or could be jurisdictional isn't wholly in an upland. So even if it didn't waste back into that stream, would that be exempt, even if it has its diversion works in a riparian area?
So I believe that it's it would be the ditch itself excavated in the uplands. So the diversion structure, if it was sited within a water of the U.S., wouldn't preclude that ditch from potentially being exempt, or potentially not being waters of the U.S. If it was excavated wholly in uplands. But again, though, that one, so that one, because it's not draining only uplands, it would fall under the second exemption, possibly. So ditches that don't contribute flow. So if that ditch is if there's a diversion structure in the stream, and that ditch isn't contributing flow, so that ditch is just taking the water from the stream and dispersing it in the upland areas, that ditch would still be exempt regardless of whether the structure for diversion is in the stream. So.
Okay, I think I got that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then
a construction of the diversion structure itself is something that may require a permit or coordination with the Corps, but the construction or the excavation of the ditch would not.
Okay.
That makes sense.
And then waste wouldn't be prohibited from being discharged into that ditch. Excuse me, Mr. Chair, follow-up.
Follow-up.
So people could discharge waste into that ditch if it's non-jurisdictional without a permit?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. One more follow-up, Mr. Chair. Julia, could you discuss a little bit further the definition between bed and banks and ordinary high water and erosional feature? I mean, I think of a swale that has noticeable indications that it has seasonal flow, but it's got a grass, it's grassy throughout. Is there a bright line between an erosional feature and a tributary that you're defining as ordinary high water and bed and banks?
I would love to say that there is always a clear, bright line. As a stream biologist, I can say that there's probably not always a clear, bright line, but I will say, so with regard to ordinary high water mark, what ordinary high water mark is essentially it's this idea that there are physical markings on the landscape of, the types of flows that occur on an ordinary basis that are of sufficient flow volume to really create these physical characteristics on the landscape. So the Corps has ordinary high water mark manuals that they've developed for determining this line in the field, and there's a whole suite of different characteristics that they would look for that would be kind of these indicators of where an ordinary high water mark exists versus where it doesn't. So one of those is changes in vegetation. So typically if you have a vegetated swale that's grassy throughout and it's consistent vegetation throughout, then that's not something that's going to have an ordinary high water mark, and that would be an erosional feature. But the transition would be where that flow in a feature concentrates enough that it starts eroding away some of that vegetation, and that flow is sufficient that that vegetation can no longer root in that channel. And so then that's when you start seeing more of this creation of the bed bank and ordinary high water mark indicators where that vegetation might break at the banks instead. So it really depends on the individual stream, but the Corps does have methods that they use to go out and evaluate where those features exist versus where they don't. And I think I'll just add one thing. We're all in this region in Montana, it's a headwater state. So this question of where does a stream start is always going to be a question, because there's lots of erosional features on the landscape that just flow following a precipitation event. And then, these features eventually flow into other features or carry enough concentrated flow that they become streams themselves. And so this question of where the stream starts, I think, is always an important question in the West. And I think that we want to make sure that whatever is in the proposed rule provides a clearer, maybe a better bright line for where that can be determined.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, just a question for Mr. Director Tubbs. Thank you, Julia. Mr. Chair, Director Tubbs, I think I understood you to say that having a ditch that is jurisdictional can be a good thing because it protects at least the state on the ditches that they own from unpermitted discharges. Is that correct?
Chairman Vincent, Representative Williams, as a ditch owner, if I were to accept a discharge from, say, an industrial plant, say stormwater drainage off of a new development up above us or something like that, you would want to build in protections about what is coming into your ditch that would not be a contaminant that you would introduce just by diverting water and using it for irrigation flow. So my first caution is be very careful before you ever say yes to that deal. And then two, if it were to be discharged, I think a state-based permit regulating that discharge would add protection to you as a ditch owner, because you could follow the permit requirements back up to through the state and to the company or whoever the discharger is.
Thank you.
As opposed to not being regulated.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Senator Hamlet.
Mr. Chairman, I have a few questions. Julia, this is Senator Hamlet, and I would like you to delve into intermittent and ephemeral streams and where you see that in the scheme of things with your proposed rule.
So where do intermittent and ephemeral streams fit in the proposed rule definition?
Yes.
Yeah, so intermittent and ephemeral streams would fall under the definition of tributary where those streams had the permanent physical characteristics of the bed, bank, and ordinary high water mark. So the science basically says that streams, regardless of their size or their flow permanence, have an important effect on downstream waters. And so where they have that permanent channel formed, where they have that bed bank and ordinary high water mark, intermittent and ephemeral streams would be considered tributaries under the definition of waters of the U.S. and would be protected under the Clean Water Act.
Follow up. Mr. Chairman, Julia, what about springs? You said, you made a statement here, groundwater's not affected, but basically a spring is where groundwater comes to surface. Are you saying then that these springs would be regulated by the federal government or not?
Potentially. If the springs, for example, were coming up in an adjacent wetland, then they would be considered protected under the Clean Water Act. If the springs were part of one of these geographically isolated features, then a spring would be evaluated with that wetland or other water feature to see if it had a significant nexus to the downstream waters. So springs, the groundwater that feeds them is not jurisdictional, but once the spring comes to the surface, it becomes a surface water. And then the question is whether it would meet the definition of water of the U.S.
Mr. Chairman, Julia, then I've got a question on return flows. You're probably aware that a lot of irrigation projects are being converted from flood irrigation into pivot irrigation, and return flows are diminishing. I mean, there could be a point in time where there's basically maybe even no return flow. Would your department look at this and say, well, there needs to be a return flow, or are you just going to let the irrigation and everything go on as it is headed this way?
So return flows from agriculture are exempted from the Clean Water Act. So it's not something that we would look for. We don't deal with water quantity issues. We would only deal with water quality issues. So, if there were changes in return flows because of changes in irrigation practices, that wouldn't be within our purview.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Julia, it looked on your diagram, though, you were saying that if you took water out of a stream and flowed through an irrigation project and then returned back into the stream, you would say that you had control over that.
Well, and again, it's a very general example of what we would potentially regulate as water of the U.S., but right now, that depends on on when there's water in that channel. So if you had a ditch where it no longer had return flows, or the return flows were incredibly infrequent, then it would be something that would potentially not be a water of the U.S. So the example that I gave there was one where that system would flow at least seasonally in and out of the stream network.
Follow up. Mr. Chairman, Julia, is the reason for these rules, or one of the reasons, by your agency, the fact that Congress has not will not change this rule? Is that part of what's going on here?
I think that if we had, if Congress could make a determination on what the congressional intent of waters of the U.S. was, that would be something that would be very, very useful. I think short of having a new law coming out of Congress, updating the regulations is the best that we can do to provide consistency and clarity on waters of the U.S.
Follow up. Mr. Chairman, Julia, so you're part of the executive branch of government, are you not?
Yes.
Okay. And if you pass this rule, the only way, in the rules implemented, the only way that the rule can be changed then is for Congress to act and pass the law. Is that correct?
Well, I believe the agencies could provide a new regulation as well. But, yes.
Follow up.
follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Julia, this is a hypothetical question, but I think it comes to the point. If your boss in the EPA and the ultimate boss, the President of the United States, said to you, I don't want this rule change, what would happen? What would be your actions?
Can I interrupt here for Julia?
Certainly.
You know,
Please state your name for the record.
This is Karen Hamilton with EPA. And, you know, we're here to provide information on the proposed rule. We really can't, you know, conjecture what the EPA might do under certain circumstances like that. If this rule were not finalized, we would continue with the existing rule that Julia described. So what we're trying to do, or what the EPA and the Corps are trying to do, is respond to people that have asked us to revise the rule because of the confusion created by the Supreme Court decisions. But, you know, trying to guess what the administration might do in the end is, you know, I think beyond our scope. It's beyond my scope. It's beyond Julia's scope today.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I would reply that you know, the executive is involved. And because it's an executive department, and if they wanted something to proceed, it will proceed. And if they don't pay attention or don't want it to proceed, you know, that would have an effect. It's all politics here. And it's all being driven by interests from different places. So I think that question does need to, I think it has been answered, although nobody wants to say it.
Any further questions or comments? I have a couple. Senator Hamlet, you have another?
I just want to make a comment, and
Certainly.
I would go now so you can have your final comments, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
I'm very uncomfortable about what's going on here, and I think there's a real good example in history of what will happen, and I think history will bear me out if this goes forward. And that's what happened to the Native American tribes with the U.S. government with their treaties. They set a treaty, it was law, and then the federal government came in and changed the laws and took more and more of their land and control over these people. And I see this as this will ultimately, if this goes forward, will happen to Montana and the citizens of the state, where the federal government will exercise more and more control over your water rights and the state's water rights. It's basically a constitutional issue of Montana says all the water that falls and flows within the boundaries of the state belong to the state of Montana for the beneficial use of its people. If this rule goes forward, the federal government will decide what's beneficial use to the citizens of the state and state of Montana. Now, you can challenge this in court, but you can only go so far, and people forget this one poignant fact with the U.S. Supreme Court. You can take a course all the way up to the Supreme Court, but they do not have to hear it. So you can get to the end of the road without ever having your day in the Supreme Court. So I think people better pay attention to what's going on here. The history of water development in the West has always been, with the federal government, has been taking water to where the people are, not moving the people to where the water is. The only example really east of the Mississippi River is the Tennessee Valley Authority. So I think this is a very crucial issue to the state of Montana. You know, I know going down the road, I'm a senior water rights holder. I know this will eventually affect my water rights. I'm not naive enough to think that it's not going to. And it's going to affect the state. So as we look forward in our development of water and what we need to do in the state for our citizens, I think it was set up to where the U.S. Congress passed our Constitution, and it says our state has control of these waters, and I think that's where the line in the sand has to be drawn. You know, if this department, the EPA, would have looked at something like the territorial waters of the U.S. and said, well, we want to extend our territorial boundaries out to 300 miles, I think everybody in the United States would support that. But I, for one, am not going to support this.
Thank you, Senator Hamlet. I have a couple of questions. I think I'm going to start with Ms. Hamilton. You mentioned in your introduction that you had several groups that had approached the EPA looking for consistency, looking for some clarification following particularly the 3 Supreme Court cases that were discussed in Julia's presentation. Who all was involved in drafting this rule?
Mr. Chairman, people in headquarters were responsible for drafting the revisions. And nobody from external to EPA and the Corps were involved. I do have a list of people that asked, or their organizations actually, that asked for the revisions.
Could we get a copy of that list
Yes.
of organizations at your convenience after you get back? That'd be great. And I'm curious as to why Region 8, or I guess it wasn't Region 8 that developed this rule, but you were a participant in that process. Not at all?
We were not participant in that process.
Okay. Did you at any point ask, I guess, DC and anybody in the region, in the headquarters that were developing this rule at that time, if they were ever going to include any of the states that were going to be ultimately impacted by it?
My understanding is that, based on what I've been told by my colleagues in DC, that there was consultation with the states. They were, but not state by state. They were consultations with state organizations, such as the Western Governors Association, National Governors Association, and other Clean Water Act administrators associations, groups like that.
So there was associations that were consulted, but there was no state like Montana, which is a headwater state, was discussed. Because from what I've gotten from talking to our agency heads, is that they had no participation in this, and they're being allowed to comment like any other public, any citizen in America on this. But you would think that they would have been given a little more, maybe some deference, or at least the opportunity to give their point of view on, once this guidance was withdrawn and these rules were being constructed, that at that point maybe that the states that were charged with implementing this guidance could have had some valuable input into this discussion. So I would hope you would. I know you can't answer why, but I would hope that you would bring that back to your friends in D.C. is that's pretty frustrating, I think, and I think the legislative branch of government here in Montana is struggling with that and not understanding why. I have a question for Julia. So I've read the Federal Register, and I've been trying to get a good grip around what exactly this is going to mean when it's finally put to the ground. And I know we've heard from Director Tubbs that I think there was a paper or something, analysis that said that this is maybe 1% to 4% increase. And I think I heard you say in your presentation that this was actually a narrowing of what was considered to be U.S. waters. Could you clarify that, or did you mean that this was a narrowing, or that one of the decisions that you were implemented actually narrowed one part of the rule?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's created a lot of confusion as well. When I say that it's a narrowing, I'm talking about the historic scope of the Clean Water Act. So I'm talking about the regulations that were drafted in the late 70s. I think that the revision to those regulations provides a narrower definition of waters of the U.S. than the 1977 regulations do. I think when these numbers come out about this potential increase in jurisdiction, it's with regard to the last few years following the Supreme Court cases. So I think what happened is, we had this historical scope of jurisdiction, and then we had the Supreme Court cases that came in and said, this definition is too broad, it needs to be narrowed in these ways. And I think that the guidance that came out following some of those Supreme Court decisions was, it was very conservative. And when they talk about there being, this 1 to 4% increase, that's compared with how we implement the existing guidance. So it is narrower than the historical definition that we've been operating under, or the current definition of waters of the U.S. It's a narrower definition, but I think that it will be different with regard to the guidance that's out there. So, for example, when you look at intermittent and ephemeral streams, historically, since 1977, the Corps would go out and they would look and see if they had an ordinary high water mark. They would consider those streams to be jurisdictional. Following the Rapanos decision, they had to be evaluated, these intermittent and ephemeral streams had to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis for a significant nexus. And there was a lot of confusion around how to evaluate under significant nexus. And so there were some streams that were determined to be not jurisdictional because they didn't have a significant nexus. And that could be due to how the Corps districts were interpreting the guidance. It could be due to the lack of data or site-specific evidence to demonstrate a nexus. And so what the proposed rule does in that instance is it says that those streams where they meet the definition of tributary have a significant nexus and are jurisdictional as a class. So that, I think, is so both is the answer. It's narrower compared with the current definition that's been in place since 1977, but this 1 to 4% number is coming from the difference between the implementing guidance that we've been operating under since 2008.
Okay. So, and that's what I'm what I'm struggling with is that, the practical application of this policy on the ground. It seems to me that 1 to 4% that is being discussed as being the new jurisdiction, extension, if you will, may be conservative in and of itself as well, because the Corps, which you guys are out here having to discuss and do the outreach for this new rule, but they have yet to step forward and discuss how they're going to how they're going to implement the rule, and how are they going. They're so busy dealing with their current caseload right now that they can't even participate in the outreach. Yet we're going to throw more work at them that they're not quite sure about how they're going to handle. So, when I'm sitting here and I'm imagining myself and I imagine my property and outside of Libby, Montana, I'm in between Libby and Kalispell. I'll just, give it an example, and you correct me if I'm wrong. I have a sump on my property that has some willows on it. I don't know if there's any cattails that ever grow in there, but it's next to, let's say that it's next to an intermittent stream that does have a bed bank and a high water mark that flows into a tributary, that 20 miles later flows into a tributary, that 15 miles later flows into the Kootenai River. So under this new rule, if I want to put some fill or take out those willows to basically fill that, I am now going to have to determine, or maybe I'm going to have to call the Corps and ask whether or not they have time to give me a JD, which could take 2 to 3 years, in which if it was determined that I am adjacent or that there is a significant nexus with those willows and that intermittent stream that is a tributary to a tributary to a tributary, that I'm then going to have to comply with the 404B1 permitting process, which is a NEPA process, which would create a federal nexus on the development of my own private land. Now, is that situation realistic, reasonable? Is that going to happen? Can you tell me that it's not?
Well, I think that what you described is what would be maybe what would happen under the existing regulations. So other than the last piece where you said that it would trigger NEPA, which it wouldn't probably require a full EIS evaluation or whatnot. Typically with individual 404 permits, just a FONSI is all that comes out of that process. But to the point that I think you're asking about, the So right now, the Corps does have a pretty busy workload, and getting a jurisdictional determination on that type of a site can take a significant amount of time. And I think what this proposed rule does and is intended to do is to eliminate the need for the case-by-case evaluation of tributaries and adjacent waters. So for the example that you gave, if you have a stream that meets the definition of a tributary and an adjacent wetland that meets the definition of wetland, then it would be something where the court would very simply look at that and say, this is something that's jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. It wouldn't require that extensive case-by-case evaluation that can take, like you said, 2 to 3 years, which I don't know if it always takes that long, but there is definitely a delay when a case-by-case jurisdictional determination needs to be made. So the goal, I think, of the proposed rule is, with regard to tributaries and with regard to adjacent waters, to take away that additional time frame that's needed for that jurisdictional determination on a case-by-case basis. And it's intended to improve the clarity of what is and isn't a water of the U.S., and improve the consistency of how the Corps determines that. So the goal is intended to eliminate these delays and to improve the way that the program operates and to improve the consistency of the program.
Okay, well, I think, and maybe it was pretty rapid fire. I was throwing that at you, Julia. So I think what your answer is that you would not have to get a JD, but you're still going to have to comply with the 404B1 requirements, which is mitigation, which is laid out in several different ways of being able to achieve that. But the point that I was making is right now that would not be considered a water of the U.S. Significant nexus. And with this new rule, it would be, is the point that I was making. But I think I've made my point. Karen, did you have?
I just wanted to follow up for a minute with your picture there. I missed the part where you described what the activity was that you were. It was a fill.
Well, it would be considered dredge and fill.
Okay. We're not the permitting agency, but the Corps does have, if you needed a permit, for minimal activities, the Corps also has nationwide permits, which are very simple they're very simple types of permitting activities. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. The point was that wouldn't be something that would be required right now because it's an intermittent next to the connection would be next to an intermittent stream. And the way the definition of tributary is being defined, it even if it's dry in August, it has a bed bank and a high water mark, which is then going to be considered to be adjacent with the significant nexus because that high water mark, that water when it does flows into a tributary that flows into a tributary that flows into a tributary. So I'm trying to give an example of the reach of this rule that I don't think has been fully thought through by not only the EPA and your agency and those that wrote the rule, but also the Corps, who is going to have to be implementing some of these situations that I think that it is just not feasible for them to be able to do because they are, they're busy. And anyways, is there any other further questions, comments? Seeing none, I wanted to thank Vice Chair Williams.
Mr. Chair, I've been involved in this discussion in my day job, and I, as Vice Chair of this committee and as a Montana State legislator, I would just encourage all of us to look as closely as we can to understand this as well as we can. There are multiple interpretations of what this is, and I think it behooves all of us as policymakers to think for ourselves, look for ourselves, and ask questions. So I just wanted to make that comment and encourage the committee members to do so.
And thank you, Vice Chair Williams. And I would also, I wanted to thank both Karen and Julie for taking the time and coming and giving a very thorough presentation. And I know you're also going to be presenting, I believe, to the Environmental Quality Council. So I know they're putting some time in to help try to answer some questions and to solicit feedback. It's up to us to give them the feedback that they're looking for. The comment period, I believe, as was stated, has been extended to October 20th. So, and maybe we could consider as a committee, maybe perhaps drafting a letter. We could talk about that. We don't have to talk about that right now, but I would certainly like to entertain that concept.